Welcome back to This is a Commander channel, where this is a Commander channel, and today I'm going to talk about how the year 2024 was the most impactful year in Magic the Gathering for lands in Commander. I mean, aside from Alpha set, of course, which gave us 9 of the dual lands and our 5 basic lands. But aside from Limited Alpha, I believe that this year has been the most impactful year for non-basic lands. Not all of the lands are winners, but a whole lot of them are really good. Like, really good. In that some of these should go into most decks that they legally can be in. Of all of the products released this year, sets and Commander precons, we got 117 new and original non-basic lands, and of those, 60 are part of either a 5-card or 10-card land cycle, and then there are 20-card cycle when we look at the MDFC lands that we got from Modern Horizon 3. If you know of any lands that I have left out for 2024, please do post them down in the comments, as I wouldn't be surprised if I left some out. So let's get into some of the more impactful ones that are worth talking about that you should be aware of for inclusion in your decks. And we'll be going through these in a order of sets released this year, not in any sort of what I think is most powerful or most impactful, just chronological and alphabetical. The first set that we got of the year was Ravnica Remastered, and from it we got 0. No new non-basics, as they were all just reprints. The next set that we got was Murders at Karlov Manor. I almost said Markov Manor. Murders at Karlov Manor, which saw the 10-card cycle of Surveil lands, like Underground Mortuary, and this has been a massively impactful cycle of lands, as they are fetchable, unlike the Scry lands that are similar to them, and most players also consider Surveil to be a better mechanic, as getting cards into your graveyard is oftentimes a lot better than just moving them to the bottom of your library. Then we got 3 other lands with Branch of Vitu-Ghazi, Escape Tunnel, and Scene of the Crime, and they all have a place in a lot of decks. Branch of Vitu-Ghazi is probably the most specific for the kind of deck that it would fit into, as it will likely only see play in decks that care about morphing or face-down cards. Escape Tunnel is a strictly better version of both Evolving Wilds, which sees play in over 1 million decks on EDH Rec, and also Terramorphic Expanse, which sees play in over 764,000 decks. Currently, Escape Tunnel only sees play in a little over 40,000 decks. But that number is sure to rise, as it does exactly what those 2 lands do, but it can also be used to make a creature with power 2 or less unblockable if you ever just need to get an attack in with your commander or some other combat damage trigger. And then, Scene of the Crime is a land, but it is also an artifact clue. So if you have a deck that cares about the number of artifacts that you have, it will help you out. But also in lands decks that will have a lot of ways to recur lands from your graveyard, it is a clue and can draw you a card when you sacrifice it. Importantly, the sacrifice to draw aspect does not require you to tap it. So it coming in tapped isn't really a big drawback for that. And it can be a sneaky, reusable card draw engine when you can recur lands. Also, it can be used to make a mana of any color. Not too beneficial, probably won't be used for that all that often, but the option is nice. The next product to release was the Ravnica Clue Edition, something that I think a lot of players have already forgotten about, but it did give us a 10-card cycle of lands like the Ballroom here that are enters tapped duels. Not the best, as we have a lot of those to choose from nowadays, but these do give you the ability to investigate each turn. It does cost 4 mana, and the land itself to be tapped, so basically 5. So it's typically costed for an ability that we would see on a land, but if you do have a deck that cares about artifacts or sacrificing things, making clues can be nice, and it is recurable as a form of draw, so it'll survive things like Farewell because it's on a land. The next product was the release of the Fallout Precons, which finished a cycle of the filter lands that we originally got all the way back in Odyssey with the allied filter lands like Darkwater Catacombs. And then, now 23 years later, we finally got the enemy filter lands like Desolate Mire. Then we got 3 other new lands with Diamond City, Helios 1, and Mariposa Military Base. Hope I'm pronouncing these all right. 2 of these are only going to show up in probably specific decks, but Diamond City is a solid land that I have added to most of my decks. It enters untapped, and it enters with a shield counter, and then you can move that shield counter onto any target creature. You're not limited to sorcery speed for when you can move the counter, but you do have to have 2 or more creatures that have entered the battlefield under your control that turn, so unless you have a way to get 2 creatures out on your opponent's turns, then you're probably just going to preemptively get that shield counter onto your commander or any other valuable creature on your turn. A land that for no mana can protect your commander from a board wipe, though, is still pretty solid. Not all board wipes, obviously Exile and Cyclonic Rift will still hit this, but especially if you can proliferate these shield counters, or if you just have like a lot of doubling season type effects that have things enter with more counters or get more counters when they do get onto them, and therefore you will also have more of them placed onto the creature when you do move them. This can be a really good way to protect those kind of commanders in those kind of decks. Helios 1 will really only see play in your energy counter decks. Not a lot of those, but if you do have one, it will be a solid removal option in that deck. And then Mariposa Military Base is another land that gives you access to recurable card draw. However, the cost of the card draw is really going to be only practical in a rad counter deck. The next product to release is Outlaws of Thunder Junction, which gave us the 10-card cycle of desert dual lands like Abraded Bluffs. They're not fetchable, but if you have a deck that cares about having damaged a player or just having somebody lose life or maybe even committing a crime, then these would be a really solid option in your deck. Then, in addition to that cycle, we got 6 other lands, starting with Arid Archway, which is just a better guildless commons because you have the chance of getting a Surveil trigger from it. Some players hate the bounce lands because they enter tapped and require you to return a land to your hand, which is oftentimes seen as a bit of a tempo hit. But if your deck is built in a certain way, if you include certain cards, that a bounce land can be really good. If you are a lands deck and you have a lot of landfall triggers out, then this can help you to hit those triggers more often, and you can also return itself over and over and over multiple times in a turn. Another thing to think about is if you run a lot of the MDFC lands, then these bounce lands let you play those as their lands earlier in the game when you actually need the mana, and then you can return them to your hand in the mid to later game so that you can actually cast them as the spell side. The next land, I'm going to butcher the name, the pronunciation of it, Bucolic Ranch, I have no clue, is a land not likely to see any play unless your deck is themed around mounts. Not really going to go into that one very much. Cactus Preserve is a land that you can animate, and if your commander has a high mana value, then this is actually a solid creature to use that can, survive after a board wipe. If your commander is like 6, 7, 8 mana value, this is a really good way to get a big 6, 7, 8 power creature right after a board wipe. Conduit Pylons is another land with a Surveil trigger on ETB. However, this one enters untapped, so it's a solid option in any Graveyard Matters deck, to just get potentially a good card in your graveyard. Mirage Mesa isn't likely to see play as it has no real utility to it other than just being a desert for decks that care about that land type. And finally, Sandstorm Verge is also not likely to see all too much play except in decks that do really want to make sure that they can get an attack in for combat damage triggers. If you play against a Voltran deck, especially if it has Vigilance, then maybe you can use it to guarantee that you can get through with that attack. Okay, now on to the big one, Modern Horizons 3, which when you include the Commander Precons for MH3, this is probably the single most impactful set for Commander lands since the format and Magic in general began. We got a 10-card cycle of fetch lands that also have a cycling card draw ability on them. These are very versatile lands that help to fix the colors of your deck, but also have synergies with any decks that like to sacrifice permanents, discard cards, or recur lands from the graveyard. In decks with the legal color identity, these are just better than Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse because you can use them for colorless mana the turn you play them as they enter untapped, and the cycling aspect is just card draw. It's great for when you just don't need lands in the later game, but you need to draw into spells to cast. Then there are the 20, yes, 20 MDFC lands that we got. I won't go over all of them, but some standouts would be Sink into Stupor, which is basically a Venser, Shaper, Savant, but for one less mana. Fell the Profane, which is an instant speed creature removal that can also hit a Planeswalker if you need it. And then Disciple of Freyles, which can be a pretty crazy elf that has a bit of a greater good effect on it to draw a ton of cards equal to the sacked creature's power, but without the discard aspect, and you even gain life, because why not? Also, these uncommon MDFC lands have the same way on the back of the land side that we saw in the original Mythic MDFCs in order to come in untapped if you pay 3 life. Now, that's only for the monocolored MDFC lands from MH3, because some of them are multicolored. They, something like Revitalizing Repast, which can be a 1-mana instant speed protection spell to save your commander, but on the backside, these lands are always enter-tapped. However, they are dual lands, which can really be helpful to fix your mana base. And now, on to the non-cycle of lands from the non-Commander Precon lands of MH3. Starting with Archway of Innovation, that is a blue land that can easily enter untapped, but more importantly, it can just for one single blue mana give your next spell Improvise. If you're running treasures, clues, food, equipment, artifact creatures, or just artifacts in general, this land can help you to cheat out a big spell or even achieve a high X spell much faster than expected. Arena of Glory is a red land that does have to exert itself for its utility, a bummer for sure, but unlike other lands that give haste like it does, it can give haste to 2 creatures that same turn, not just 1 creature that turn. Monumental Henge is a white land that for 4 mana lets you get the best historic card from the top 5 cards of your library, oftentimes better than just drawing one of the top card, no matter what it is. But this way you get to pick the best of the 5 historics. Shifting Woodland is a green land that does have a delirium requirement of having card types in your graveyard, but the reward for that is crazy, as it becomes a version of Mirage Mirror that can become a copy of any permanent in your graveyard. So in any Graveyard Matters deck, this land can just become a Villas, or whatever kind of creature you'd like to reanimate. Or if you accidentally mill, if you're doing a lot of self-mill and you milled away a very important non-creature or creature card, that you can still get that card onto the battlefield via this woodland card. Spymaster's Vault is a black land that lets you have any target creature you control connive for X, where X is equal to the number of creatures that have died this turn. Not just creatures you control that have died this turn, but all creatures from all players that have died this turn. This is an amazing card selection, being connive for just a single black mana. It is also a great way to buff up a creature a whole lot. And then, of course, it is a fantastic way to fill up your graveyard with anything that you would like to be in your graveyard. If Surveil 1 lands are great, a recurable land that can constantly fuel your graveyard, this card's just insane. This is one of a serious sleeper that I think a lot of players are missing out on. Not much to talk about the next land, however. It's our first ever printing of a snow-covered waste. So for decks that care about snow, this can help them out. And if you're a colorless deck that runs Field of the Dead, then you have a few more ways to trigger that land more often, due to it being a different name than standard waste. Next up is Urza's Cave, which is not just another Urza's type land for your Urza's Workshop, but it is also just the best land in your whole deck because it is a land version of Expedition Map. But I think it's even better than Expedition Map. Collectively, Expedition Map costs 1 to play and then 2 to crack, so 3 in total, spread out over 2 turns. But then, for that same amount, that 3 mana, you can crack the cave. However, unlike the map, the cave puts the land straight onto the battlefield. It does go in tapped, so sometimes when you haven't hit your land drop, the map could be better, but I still think having it go straight to the battlefield is better. An amazing land to get double landfall triggers in a lands deck, but also just a fantastic way to get out your most powerful lands from your deck. And then finally, we got Ugin's Labyrinth, which is our latest enters untapped land that can tap for 2 colorless mana that very turn that you play it. In the right deck, this is some great ramp. Now on to the Modern Horizons 3 Commander Precon lands, and I think that these are some of the best lands we've seen yet. Or at least the most generally good in a lot of most decks. Starting with Horizon of Progress. It does 3 things from other lands. It is a slightly worse version of Reflecting Pool for its first ability. Its second ability is a slightly improved version of Terrain Generator that can put any land out and ramp you, not just basics, but for 1 mana more for the cost. And then finally, you can just sacrifice it to draw a card, like the lands that we got in the original Modern Horizons that the Horizon Canopy started with way back in Future Sight. Next, Lazotep Quarry is a very cool land that has a version of the ability that we see on the Scarab God that lets you exile a creature card from your own graveyard and make a token copy of it, but it's now a 4/4 black zombie. Obviously, the version of this ability on the Scarab God is a bit better as it's capped at 4 mana. It doesn't scale with the bigger creatures, but it can also be done at instant speed on the Scarab God, and it can hit any creature in any player's graveyard. But the Quarry is, of course, really good because it's on a land. And it can be run in any deck, not just limited to a blue or black deck. You can run the Quarry as a second version of Command Beacon. If your commander gets killed, let it go to the graveyard, and instead of racking up yet another commander tax when you recast it from the command zone, you can just get a token copy of it from your Quarry. And if you don't care about actual commander damage, well, that's just great. And you might even end up with a bigger version of your commander. A side bonus to it, it has a creature sack ability on it, so you can use it to dodge those really annoying enchantments that lock your commander out, like Darksteel Mutation and Imprisoned in the Moon. Next up is Planar Nexus, which is, I think, one of the lesser lands from MH3 in general. You'll only really run it in a deck that cares about certain kinds of non-basic land types, but if you do care about that, well, then hey, here you go. Sunken Palace is a blue land, the only color-specific land from the MH3 precons, and it lets you straight up copy a spell or activated ability. You do have to exile 3 cards from your graveyard, but the mana cost for this is just 2 mana, which is crazy when compared to other non-land things that do this effect. Next up is one of my personal favorite lands from the year, Talon Gates of Madara, because for 4 mana, you can just put it out from your hand onto the battlefield, getting around your land drop limit for that turn, but more importantly is that when it ETBs, you can phase out any one target creature. This is so cool as you can use it to protect your commander or any other important creature in response to a board wipe, even ones like Cyclonic Rift and Farewell, but you can also just phase out something like a Blightsteel Colossus that's coming at you to kill you. This land has such a diverse suite of options, and to reference back to the Urza's Cave, you can just use that to fetch this one out if it's in your library. Get that ETB at instant speed as a surprise. And finally, Trench Post, which isn't all that great. It is mostly for decks that care about Locust lands, and I don't see that happening outside of colorless decks or something like an Omo deck. And that wraps up MH3, probably the most impactful lands set of the last 3 decades, and we will follow that up with the Assassin's Creed product, which gave us not much, just 2 lands, starting with the better of the 2, Abstergo Entertainment, which enters tapped and can add a colorless mana with no restriction, and it can also filter to any color, but then it has a very solid ability to return a historic card from your graveyard to your hand. It does exile itself as part of the cost, so I don't see a lot of decks recurring this all that often, but it's still a similar thing to something like Command Beacon and the Lazotep Quarry, in that you can use these lands to get your commander back without increasing your command tax. Clearly, the Command Beacon is the best of all these at doing that specifically with your commander, which is why that card was once over $20. But these cards have a bit more utility to them. They have more options, like this Abstergo Entertainment being able to get back any historic card, even non-permanent ones, like any legendary, like something like the legendary sorceries that we got back in Dominaria. A very cool effect for just 3 mana on an untapped land. And then the other land I expect will not see a lot of play is Brotherhood Headquarters, which just lets you tap it for a mana of any color, but only for assassin spells or assassin abilities, or to cast a spell for its free running alternate cost. Then we got the very popular Bloomburrow set, which did give us some solid lands, starting with Fountain Port, which is basically the land version of Trading Post, allowing you to draw cards, make creatures, and also just make treasures, but for no drawback, other than the fact that making the treasure costs 4 mana and tapping the land itself. But it's recurable. The next 5 lands are a bit of an uncommon cycle that cares about certain creature types. I don't think that these will see too much play outside of Mudflat Village and Rockface Village, as they're really good in decks that the commander is the creature type that they care about. The Mudflat Village can get your bat, lizard, rat, or most likely your squirrel commander back from your graveyard to your hand, again avoiding that command tax increase, and then the Rockface Village can give your lizard, mouse, otter, or raccoon commander haste. Those creature types not as common as squirrel, but hey, if you do have that type, another haste land is great. And then finally, another of one of my most favorite lands from the year, 3 Tree City, is basically a new version of Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx, but instead of devotion, it just cares about the number of creatures of a type that you chose when it entered. For token decks or any kindred decks like dragons, elves, zombies, etc., this thing is pretty crazy. Most tokens don't add to your devotion, but this city will still help you to ramp you a whole lot with a lot of those creature tokens out. And now we're getting close to the end with the release of Duskmourn, House of Horror, which had 2 cycles of lands in it. The first is a 10-card cycle of dual lands that enter tapped unless there is a player with 13 or less life. Sadly, this isn't a card cycle we're likely to see all that much of, which is a shame because the art on some of these lands, like Abandoned Campground, is quite good. Despite having 4 players in a commander game that could have 13 or less life, the fact that we start at 40 makes it unlikely for these lands to ever enter untapped until much later in a game, and people really want their lands to enter untapped at the earlier parts of the game when the jumps from 1 to 2 or 2 to 3 lands is much more crucial and impactful than just going from 9 to 10 lands in the later game. The next cycle is smaller, but I think that we could see these cards from time to time, especially when they finish the cycle, and that is the cycle of Verge lands like Flood Farm Verge and Gloomlake Verge. I would compare this land cycle to something similar to the Nimbus Maze that we got way back in Future Sight, and then also to the Tainted cycle of lands that we got way back in Torment. I actually use the Tainted lands in my 2-color decks that have black, and I have an original Nimbus Maze, so I do like to run that in a deck. And their ability to always enter untapped is solid. So we could see these show up from time to time, but I hope that their existence doesn't mean that we will never get a full cycle to complete what the Nimbus Maze started. And then, beyond those 2 cycles of lands, Duskmourn gave us one last non-basic land in the form of Valgavoth's Lair, which enters tapped, and therefore is not likely to see any real play outside of decks that don't care about card types, or specifically enchantments as the card type, as the land is currently one of only 2 cards in all of Magic that is both a land and an enchantment on the actual land side. You can't cast a land, or at least not as of making this video. Maybe one day WotC will find a way to make that happen. So Enchantress decks won't really care about this Valgavoth's Lair, but commanders like Renmaw, Creaking Nest, Baba Lysaga, Night Witch, and from the main Duskmourn proper set, Marina Vendril can get the lair into hand. Speaking of Valgavoth's Lair, it not having the land type of lair, like the cycle of lands way back in Planeshift, is such a travesty to me. Anyhow, moving on to the final set of the year, Foundations, which was a core set and therefore was primarily reprints. However, we did get a single new land from Foundations, and it does something fairly interesting, as it's a land that you can animate into a creature. However, unlike other animated lands, it stays as the creature form while still being a land. It doesn't go back to a land after the end of that turn. Some players might see this as a bonus, as you don't have to continuously put more and more mana into it, turning it into a creature each turn. However, other players like them actually to go back to being just lands on not their turns, because they will survive board wipes. I love this land for my Omo deck, as it doesn't need to have that everything counter on it to get the perks from all the Kindred stuff that is out. Okay, so there we have it, all 117 of the new lands that we got in 2024, assuming I didn't forget any and leave them off. Let me know if I did. I would also like to hear from you guys. I would really like to read which lands you think are the most impactful from this year. Which ones will you be adding to your decks? Is there a year that was more impactful than this year? We got the first wave of fetch lands in 2002 with Onslaught, and then we got both halves of the shock lands in 2006 between Guild Pack and Dissension. So do those alone make their respective years more impactful to Magic and Commander than 2024? I know earlier on I said that I wouldn't be covering them in the order of my believed power, but I guess here at the end, I'll say which ones interest me the most, the ones that I think the most are the most powerful. If I had to pick a top 5 with a cycle of lands counting as just one, I guess I'd say in no particular order that they would be Talon Gates of Madara, because I love protecting my creatures, especially my commander, from board wipes. Spymaster's Vault, because that's just insane value to buff a creature that big, and also the ability to fuel your land. I've got a lot of decks that are reanimators and cares about things in the graveyard. So yeah, that's Spymaster Vault. I think a lot of people are sleeping on that. That should not be $1. Three Tree City, just because I have tons of token decks and Kindred decks. So that's in like well over like 15 of my decks. Arena of Glory, because I love haste. I despise playing my commander or important creatures and then having them get wiped when it goes around the table and finally gets back to me and I don't have that creature to attack. So I really, really like haste lands. Monumental Hinge, I think, is really, really good. I run a lot of lands that give you card advantage. So that one, the ability to get the best of the top 5 cards for only 4 mana on that, when a lot of those lands that do card draw are like 3 mana and tap that land to get a card draw. So it's only 1 mana more, but card selection of 5 is really good. And then Lazotep Quarry, I like that one. Just again, I dislike my commander dying and having to recast it and building up that command tax. There's so many board wipes. There's so much targeted removal in Commander these days. So I really like to have lands that can get around that. I guess that one also would be tied possibly with the one from Assassin's Creed. Very, very similar effect. I can't pick between the MDFCs. They're all just insanely good. I'm sure a lot of them would have made it into my top 5. So if I had to pick a 6th one as an honorable mention, I would actually have to go with something like Urza's Cave, because it is just any of these lands that you just need to search up. I'm going to be adding Urza's Cave to a lot of my decks. I especially have a non-black Reanimator deck that's built around that, Emeria, the Emeria land that needs 7 planes, so now I can use that to search that up. But yeah, that land is just crazy. I have a lot of really, really cool lands and a lot of decks that I would like to search up. Let's see, what else? I also believe that these Surveil lands are probably going to be the most impactful, although I think really that Urza's Cave should be. I just, unless you don't run any kind of impactful lands, and that honestly should be in like 95% of decks. It's great for mana fixing. It's just great for hitting landfalls. It triggers land, like sacrifice things. But just the ability to search up Cabal Coffers, Urberg, it's so good. But I still think that, practically speaking, I think the Surveil lands, because of how many they are, I think that those being fetchable, and being able to set up your next card draw, or just to feed your graveyard, is something that a lot of decks wants. But hey, you can even search up those Surveil lands with Urza's Cave. So again, Urza's Cave just wins. It's a tutor. Everything. Tutors always win. They're the most versatile things. Anyhow, that's all I've got for today's episode. As always, I hope that all of you have found this video to be entertaining at least, and I hope that it gets a few of you to be really thinking deeply about Magic and how impactful an insane 2024 was. Oh my goodness, 2025 might be even more impactful. That scares me to think that we're going to get... Oh my goodness. Have a good one. Ta-ta.